There are houses in Boston that do not forget. They hold memory in their banisters, in the careful polish of their floors, in the way servants step lightly as though grief itself might be resting in the next room. The Hargrove residence on Commonwealth Avenue was one of those houses. Eleanor Shaw understood such houses. She had grown up in one. 10 years ago, the Shaw name had been engraved in brass beside a banking office on State Street. 10 years ago, men had shaken her father's hand with respect. Then the accusation came: fraud, misallocation, deliberate deception, and the brass plate was removed before the week was over. No charges ever fully proved, no trial that satisfied anyone. Just whispers, then silence. Eleanor had learned what silence could do. At 32, she carried it well. She dressed plainly. She spoke softly. She allowed wealthy households to forget she was present. It was a useful skill for a private tutor. It was even more useful for a woman who spent her evenings hunched over ledgers by lamplight, copying figures from old financial reports no one else cared to revisit. The Hargrove position came recommended by a widow who valued Eleanor's discipline with Latin and arithmetic. 2 children, a grieving father, discretion required. She arrived on a gray October morning. The door was opened by a housekeeper whose expression revealed nothing and everything at once. This house had been orderly once, and now it was careful. Thomas Hargrove received her in the study. He stood when she entered. He was not what she expected. Boston society spoke of him as formidable, decisive, unassailable in shipping circles. But the man before her carried something quieter. Grief, perhaps. His voice was measured, his handshake brief. "My children require structure," he said. "Their mother valued discipline." "I value it as well," Eleanor replied. His gaze lingered a fraction too long, as if measuring whether she understood more than grammar and sums. Then he nodded. "You'll have access to the East Wing during school hours. My wife's rooms remain private." There it was, the locked center of the house. Eleanor inclined her head. Of course. The children were intelligent, particularly the eldest daughter, who observed Eleanor the way one studies a witness rather than a teacher. Lessons began. Latin declensions, geography maps, the rhythm of routine slowly settling into place. And then, on her 3rd week, she saw it. The household accounts lay open on a small escritoire in the morning room, likely forgotten by a clerk in haste. Columns of shipping transfers, asset reallocations, layered holding entries structured beneath primary accounts. Her breath did not change, but her eyes did. The architecture was unmistakable. She had copied this pattern by hand for years, in the old Shaw banking ledgers, in the evidence that had destroyed her father. The formatting was identical. Even the sequence of subsidiary notations matched. Someone in this house was building something the same way. Eleanor closed the book precisely as she had found it. Across the hall, she heard Mr. Hargrove speaking in low tones to a man whose voice she did not yet recognize, smooth, confident, assured. A business partner, perhaps. She returned to her pupils and continued the lesson as though nothing had shifted. But that evening, beneath the yellow glow of her boarding room lamp, she opened her father's archived records and began to copy again. For the first time in 10 years, the pattern had a living address. There are patterns that only reveal themselves to those who have been broken by them. Eleanor did not sleep much that week. Each evening after lessons, she returned to her narrow boarding room and spread her father's ledgers across the small writing desk. The pages were softened with age, corners worn thin from years of handling. She had memorized many of the figures, the way other daughters might remember lullabies. Now she placed beside them the numbers she had quietly transcribed from the Hargrove household accounts. 2 columns, 2 decades apart. The resemblance was not superficial. Layered subsidiaries, transfers routed through intermediate entities that dissolved within months, profits appearing to stabilize one quarter only to vanish into development investments the next. On paper, everything balanced. In reality, value bled invisibly. It was the same architecture that had swallowed her father's reputation whole. The next morning, Boston society moved as it always did, orderly, confident, convinced of its own permanence. Eleanor entered the Hargrove house with the calm precision of a woman who knew her place within it. The servants nodded. The children waited at the long mahogany table in the schoolroom. Thomas Hargrove joined them briefly before departing for the docks. He reviewed his son's arithmetic with unexpected patience, correcting gently, never sharply. When he turned to Eleanor, his expression was composed but searching. "My late wife believed education was the only inheritance that could not be mismanaged," he said. Eleanor held his gaze. "That is a wise belief." Something softened in his features at that, grief shifting beneath discipline. It was not the face of a careless man, which made the pattern more dangerous. Later that afternoon, the man with the smooth voice returned. He entered the study without knocking, a familiarity that suggested ownership of more than conversation. "Miss Shaw," Thomas said, "this is Mr. Edwin Mercer, my business partner." Mercer's smile was precise. "A pleasure." His handshake lingered a fraction too long. His eyes did not linger at all. Eleanor inclined her head. "Sir." She noticed the way Mercer's fingers rested on the open ledger atop the desk, protective, proprietary. She noticed the subtle tightening in his jaw when Thomas mentioned reviewing estate transfers from the period of his wife's illness. Estate transfers. Managed, no doubt, during the months when grief makes oversight difficult. That evening, while retrieving a misplaced grammar text from a side table in the sitting room, Eleanor saw a folded memorandum tucked between the pages of a shipping report. Private advisory consultation. Dated 8 months before Mrs. Hargrove's death. The consultant's name was not listed, but the destination address was unmistakable. Shaw and Company Banking. Her father's firm. The paper trembled once in her hand before she stilled it. Mrs. Hargrove had reached out, and her father had never spoken of it. Across the hall, Mercer's voice drifted faintly through the study door, confident, assured, discussing quarterly projections. Eleanor slid the memorandum back into place. This was no coincidence. The ruin that had destroyed her family had extended its reach into this house long before she ever crossed its threshold. Grief has a way of preserving rooms. They become museums to a single life, dusted, untouched, suspended in time. The east wing of the Hargrove residence held such a room. Eleanor had passed its door many times, noting the key kept on a narrow silver hook just inside Thomas's private study. Not hidden, merely respected. On a Thursday afternoon, the eldest daughter approached her desk after lessons. "Miss Shaw," she said carefully, "Father wishes Mother's books cataloged for donation. He said you may enter the room." The key was placed in Eleanor's palm with deliberate ceremony. The lock turned with a soft resistance, as if disturbed from sleep. The air inside was faintly scented with lavender and old paper. Curtains drawn, writing desk precisely arranged. A life paused rather than ended. Eleanor did not begin with the wardrobe or the jewelry case. She went to the shelves. Financial texts were interspersed with novels, shipping indexes beside volumes of correspondence etiquette. Mrs. Hargrove had been no idle society wife. Eleanor moved methodically, removing books one at a time. Inside the third ledger she opened, something thinner slipped free, folded stationery, sealed but never posted. Her breath stilled. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was firm, elegant. "Mr. Shaw, I believe I have uncovered a structural irregularity within my husband's shipping accounts. The transfers are not in themselves unlawful, yet their layering obscures liability in a manner that concerns me. I fear Mr. Mercer's influence exceeds what I had understood. I seek your discretion and counsel before I confront anyone directly. The letter was dated 9 months before her death. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the page. There were more. 5 letters in total, each progressively more urgent. Mrs. Hargrove detailing specific subsidiary patterns, identical to those that had collapsed Shaw and Company. Identical to those now operating quietly beneath this roof. The final letter was incomplete. Mr. Shaw, I no longer believe this is mismanagement. I believe it is deliberate. If anything should happen before we resolve this matter. The sentence ended mid-line. The date at the top chilled her. 3 days before Mrs. Hargrove's fatal carriage accident. Eleanor sat very still in the late afternoon light. Her father had never mentioned correspondence from a Hargrove, but during those months his own firm had begun its inexplicable decline, investments evaporating, liability redirected, his protests dismissed as incompetence. He had been fighting something larger than anyone knew. Footsteps sounded faintly in the corridor. Eleanor gathered the letters quickly, sliding them between the pages of a volume of maritime law. She replaced the remaining books exactly as she had found them. When she stepped back into the hall, Thomas stood at the far end, watching her. For a moment, neither spoke. You found what you needed, he asked quietly. Eleanor held his gaze, her composure intact. Yes, she said, I believe I did. Behind his grief, something unreadable flickered. And somewhere else in the house, a door closed with deliberate force. There are men who hide behind authority. Thomas Hargrove did not. That was what made him dangerous to Eleanor's resolve. In the weeks that followed her discovery in the East Wing, she observed him more closely than she intended. Not as a woman might observe a man, but as an investigator studies a subject whose guilt cannot yet be determined. He rose early, reviewed doc reports before breakfast, sat with his children in the evenings rather than retreating to his study. When his daughter struggled with French composition, he attempted to help poorly but earnestly. Grief had not hardened him. It had disciplined him. If he was complicit, he wore it well. One evening, rain pressed against the tall windows while the children practiced penmanship. Thomas remained in the room, reviewing correspondence. The firelight softened the angles of his face. You favor structured instruction, he remarked without looking up. I find structure reveals character, Eleanor replied. He glanced at her then, faintly amused. In children. In everyone. A quiet passed between them, not uncomfortable but measuring. She allowed herself a careful question. Your estate accounts must require similar discipline. My partner oversees the technicalities, he said. Mercer has a mind for architecture. Architecture. The word tightened something beneath her ribs. During your wife's illness, she continued gently, did you find yourself removed from oversight? He closed the letter in his hands. For a time. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. She handled more than I realized, he added. I was occupied. With grief, with denial, with trust. Before Eleanor could respond, the study door opened without knock or announcement. Edwin Mercer entered, as though summoned by implication. Thomas, he said smoothly, we must discuss the Norfolk transfer. His gaze shifted briefly to Eleanor, assessing, calculating. Thomas rose. Excuse us, Miss Shaw. Eleanor inclined her head and gathered the children's copybooks, though she remained within earshot as propriety allowed. Mercer's tone lowered but carried enough edge to cut through distance. There have been inquiries regarding historical reallocations, minor but persistent. Inquiries from whom? Thomas asked. From those who do not understand the necessity of discretion. A pause. You are aware, Mercer continued, that misplaced trust has undone better men than us. Eleanor did not look toward the door. She did not need to. The warning was not for Thomas. Later that night, reviewing additional entries in the household accounts, Eleanor uncovered a series of authorizations dated during the precise months her father's firm began its collapse. Each bore Mercer's notation. And beneath them, a temporary transfer of oversight signed during Mrs. Hargrove's confinement to her sickbed. Mercer had held control of both firms at critical moments. The rain had stopped by the time Eleanor closed the ledger. But the house felt altered. For the first time, she no longer questioned whether a fraud existed. Only whether the man she was beginning to understand stood as victim beside her. Or architect across from her. Boston did not shout when it destroyed a reputation. It murmured. The murmuring began at a dinner Eleanor had not been invited to attend. The Hargrove residence hosted 12 guests that evening, bankers, shipping investors, 2 members of the municipal council. Eleanor remained upstairs with the children, reviewing history lessons while the low hum of cultivated conversation drifted through the floorboards. She heard her name once. Then again. Not loudly, not unkindly. Curiously. When she descended later to retrieve a misplaced book from the morning room, the air still held the scent of cigars and restraint. 2 women paused mid-sentence when they saw her. One smiled with thin civility. You are the tutor, I believe, she said. Yes, ma'am. How fortunate the Hargrove children are to receive such devoted attention. The emphasis rested not on fortunate. Eleanor inclined her head and continued past them. She had learned long ago that society rarely attacked directly. It eroded. By the following week, the erosion had reached Thomas. He summoned her to the study, not unkindly, but with a gravity that unsettled her. I am told, he began carefully, that you have shown unusual interest in household records. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. I value order. So do I. He studied her face, as though searching for something beneath its composure. Miss Shaw, he continued, Boston is not forgiving. A paid employee examining private accounts may invite interpretation. Interpretation from whom? She asked evenly. He did not answer immediately. From those who benefit from it, he said at last. Mercer's shadow lay heavy in the silence. Eleanor felt the walls closing, not physically, but socially. A tutor accusing her employer or even questioning him would be dismissed before the ink dried on her statement. Her father had learned that lesson too late. I assure you, she said quietly, I seek no harm to your household. His gaze softened, but only slightly. I believe you. The words should have reassured her. Instead, they complicated everything. 2 days later, Mercer requested a private audience with Thomas, while Eleanor supervised Latin exercises across the hall. You are aware, Mercer's voice carried just enough, that Shaw and Company's collapse is under renewed quiet discussion. There are those who find coincidence in Miss Shaw's employment here. A deliberate pause. It would be regrettable, Mercer continued, if misplaced loyalty endangered your family's standing. The implication was clean. Dismiss her. Eleanor's pulse did not quicken. She finished correcting a declension error, closed the grammar text, and dismissed the children for luncheon. By the time she returned to her small desk in the schoolroom, she understood the full shape of the trap. If she moved too soon, she would be labeled opportunistic. A disgraced banker's daughter leveraging employment for revenge. If she waited too long, Mercer would remove her before she secured proof. Boston society did not need evidence. It needed narrative. And Mercer was already writing one. There is a moment in every quiet war when patience becomes indistinguishable from cowardice. Eleanor felt that moment approaching. The evidence in her possession was no longer circumstantial. Over the past fortnight, she had traced overlapping transfers between Shaw and Company and Hargrove Shipping during the precise quarters both firms destabilized. Identical subsidiary shells, identical withdrawal pacing, identical signatures authorizing temporary control during periods of incapacity. Mercer's handwriting appeared too often to dismiss. What she did not yet possess was proof that Thomas knew. That distinction mattered more than she cared to admit. On a brisk November afternoon, she stood in the schoolroom while the children practiced recitation. The eldest daughter's gaze lingered on her again, perceptive, steady. "You are troubled," the girl said once her brother had left the room. "Am I?" Eleanor asked lightly. "You read numbers the way Father reads shipping routes," the girl replied. "When something is wrong, you go very still." Eleanor closed the ledger before her. "And what do you do when something is wrong?" The girl considered this. "I decide whether it is my responsibility to fix it." The simplicity of it unsettled her. That evening, she reviewed a fresh set of documents obtained under the pretense of assisting with estate inventory. Among them was a temporary oversight authorization signed by Thomas during his wife's final months. But the signature did not align with his natural hand. It bore the stiffness of imitation. Forged or signed under pressure. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Thomas stood in the doorway of the study, jacket removed, sleeves rolled, less magnate, more man. "I am told," he began, "that Mr. Mercer has expressed concern regarding your continued employment." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "Has he?" "He suggests your presence may be complicated." "And do you agree?" A long pause. "I prefer clarity," he said at last. So did she. The truth pressed against her restraint. She could place the letters before him now, Mrs. Hargrove's pleas, the incomplete warning, the overlapping fraud architecture. But if she misjudged him, if he stood aligned with Mercer rather than opposed, she would lose everything. Her father's name, the letters, the fragile position that allowed her access. "I value this position," she said carefully. "I would not endanger it without cause." His eyes searched hers. "Nor would I endanger my family." The words held weight. After he left, Eleanor unfolded Mrs. Hargrove's final unfinished letter once more. "If anything should happen before we resolve this matter." Resolve what? Expose whom? Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of harbor horns. Inside, footsteps echoed down the corridor, firmer than usual, purposeful. Moments later, the housekeeper appeared at the schoolroom door. "Miss Shaw," she said gently, "Mr. Mercer has requested a meeting regarding the children's instruction." Eleanor understood. This was not about instruction. It was about removal. The line she had been unwilling to cross was moving toward her, whether she stepped over it or not. Boston filled its commission, chambers the way it filled its churches, with posture. The banking commission convened on a gray morning heavy with rumor. Polished wood, elevated benches, men whose signatures could preserve or dismantle reputations with equal ease. Eleanor had not been informed in advance. She learned of it from the eldest daughter, who entered the schoolroom pale but composed. "Father has gone to Beacon Hill," she said. "There was a letter delivered at dawn." Eleanor's pulse steadied rather than raced. Dawn letters were rarely kind. By midday, Whispers reached the Hargrove residence like smoke under a door. Thomas Hargrove had formally petitioned the commission to reopen the case of Shaw and Company banking. He had named his own business partner in the request. Alina stood very still when she heard it. He had acted without her. Without the completed evidence she had worked years to assemble, without protection for his own standing, without assurance she would trust the gesture. By afternoon, the newspapers had it, not in bold accusation, but in restrained astonishment. Prominent shipping magnate requests review of decade-old financial collapse. Boston society did not know what to do with voluntary self-implication. When Thomas returned that evening, he did not retreat to his study. He entered the schoolroom directly. The children were dismissed quietly. Alina remained standing. "You went to the commission," she said. "Yes." "You named Mr. Mercer." "Yes." "On what basis?" "On the basis," he replied evenly, "that I have reason to believe oversight during my wife's illness was misused." "Reason." "Not proof." "You have not seen the full documentation," she said carefully. "I have seen enough." His gaze did not waver. "I will not allow my family's name to rest upon suspicion," he continued. "If there is rot within it, it will be cut out publicly." The words were not dramatic. They were final. "Do you understand what this will cost you?" she asked. "Yes." Boston would fracture around him. Investors would withdraw. Invitations would vanish. Mercer would not remain silent. As if summoned by thought, a messenger arrived within the hour bearing a formal statement from Edwin Mercer. He would attend the hearing. He would present evidence demonstrating that Alina Shaw's employment in the Hargrove household constituted deliberate infiltration, that she had manipulated access to financial documents, that her father's disgrace was motive enough. The attack was precise. Thomas read the statement without visible reaction. "They will attempt to discredit you," he said quietly. "They will not need to attempt," Alina replied. "They will succeed if I am unprepared." He stepped closer, not intimately but deliberately. "I did not act for condition," he said, "nor for gratitude." "For what then?" she asked. "For truth," he answered, "and because my wife believed in it strongly enough to write to your father." Silence held between them. He had chosen the fracture before she had finished building the case. And in doing so, he had made retreat impossible for them both. The hearing was set for 3 days hence. Boston was listening. The banking commission chamber did not echo. It absorbed. Every word spoken beneath its high plaster ceiling seemed to settle into the wood-paneled walls, waiting to be weighed and remembered. Boston's most deliberate men occupied the elevated bench. Observers filled the gallery, bankers, shipping rivals, reporters who understood that reputations were more valuable than cargo. Alina sat alone at a narrow table to the left. Thomas sat at another to the right. They did not look at one another. Edwin Mercer stood between them when called forward, immaculate as ever. His voice carried easily. "It is regrettable," he began, "that private employment has been leveraged into public spectacle." A murmur, swiftly contained. Mercer continued, outlining Alina's position within the Hargrove household. Access to records, opportunity, a father disgraced by fraud, a decade of motive. "It would not be unreasonable," he concluded smoothly, "to consider whether Miss Shaw sought proximity to restore her family's name through calculated association." The implication was surgical. Alina rose when addressed. "Miss Shaw," the chairman said, "you have heard the assertion that your employment was strategic." "Yes, sir." "And was it?" "No." She allowed the silence to extend, not defensively, but deliberately. "I accepted a position as tutor," she said evenly. "I did not seek entry into financial records. I recognized a pattern when I encountered it." "A pattern of what?" another commissioner asked. "Of structured misallocation, designed to obscure liability through subsidiary layering." Several heads lifted at the precision of her phrasing. Mercer's smile did not falter. "Miss Shaw," he said lightly, "you speak as though uniquely qualified to identify such structures." "I am," she replied. A faint stir. She placed a small stack of letters on the table before her. "These were written by Mrs. Hargrove," she said, "addressed to my father, dated prior to her death." Thomas's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Mercer's expression tightened, just once. "At your request," Eleanor continued, addressing the bench, "I ask that they be read aloud." The chairman gestured to the clerk. The first letter was unfolded. The chamber listened as Mrs. Hargrove's elegant hand described irregular transfers, concern regarding Mr. Mercer's expanding control, a request for Mr. Shaw's discretion. The second letter followed. Then the third. By the time the unfinished final page was read, if anything should happen before we resolve this matter, the air in the chamber had altered. Mercer stepped forward sharply. "These letters prove nothing of criminal intent," he said. "Concern is not evidence." "No," Eleanor agreed calmly, "but patterns are." She produced a ledger excerpt. "Transfers authorized during Mr. Hargrove's documented absence at his wife's bedside. Signatures inconsistent with his established hand." All eyes shifted to Thomas. For the first time since proceedings began, he stood. "That authorization," he said, voice steady, "bears my name." A ripple moved through the room. "But I did not write it." The words did not rise. They settled. The chairman leaned forward. "Are you alleging forgery within your own firm, Mr. Hargrove?" Thomas did not hesitate. "Yes." And in that single syllable, Boston understood that this would not end quietly. The word lingered in the chamber long after Thomas spoke it. Forgery. It was not an accusation made lightly in Boston, not by a man whose signature had opened half the harbor's trade routes. The commissioners conferred in low tones before the chairman addressed him again. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, "you are prepared to testify under oath that this authorization was not executed by your hand." "I am," Thomas replied. He stepped forward, removing his gloves with deliberate calm. A clerk placed a prior shipping contract before him, one unquestionably signed years earlier. The comparison was unavoidable. The natural curve of his script differed from the rigid strokes in the contested ledger. Small distinctions. Decisive ones. Edwin Mercer did not immediately respond. He adjusted his cuffs instead, composure carefully restored. "Memory is unreliable in grief," he said at last. "It is possible Mr. Hargrove does not recall signing during a period of distress." Thomas did not look at him. "I recall my wife's illness with painful clarity," he said. "I do not recall relinquishing oversight in the manner reflected here." Eleanor watched Mercer closely. For the first time since she had known him, calculation faltered into irritation. The commissioners requested the timeline of oversight transfers from both firms, Shaw and Company and Hargrove Shipping. Clerks hurried. Pages were stacked, dates aligned across a long oak table. The pattern emerged visibly now, overlapping reallocations executed, while one principal or the other was distracted by personal crisis. 2 decades of engineered vulnerability. Mercer's voice sharpened. "You will not dismantle a respected enterprise on the speculation of a dismissed banker's daughter." The words struck the chamber like a misjudged note. Elena rose before she was called. "My father was never dismissed," she said quietly. "He was overwhelmed." A commissioner glanced toward the compiled documents. "Mr. Mercer," he said evenly, "these subsidiaries appear to dissolve shortly after each transfer." "Standard risk insulation," Mercer replied. "Insulation," the commissioner repeated. "That coincides precisely with personal incapacities across two firms." Silence tightened. Thomas spoke again, not loudly, but with unmistakable finality. "If my family name survives this inquiry, it will do so because it has been examined fully, not because it was shielded." Mercer turned to him sharply. "You would fracture every relationship this family holds." "I would fracture them," Thomas answered, "before I build them on deceit." The words altered the room. By the close of the session, the commission announced a formal forensic audit of both enterprises. Mercer was ordered to submit all subsidiary documentation pending review. Boston would not render a verdict that day. But the tide had shifted. As the chamber emptied, an attendant approached Elena quietly. "Miss Shaw," he said, "the commission requests copies of your father's archived ledgers for comparative analysis." Her father's name, spoken without disdain. It was not yet exoneration, but it was acknowledgement. Across the room, Thomas met her gaze at last. He had placed his legacy at risk in public view. And now, whether she wished it or not, their fates were braided together in the open. Justice, in Boston, did not arrive with applause. It arrived in print. 3 weeks after the hearing, the commission's findings were released in restrained language that carried devastating weight. Edwin Mercer had orchestrated a long-standing system of subsidiary misallocation across multiple firms, exploiting moments of personal vulnerability to assume temporary control, forged authorizations, layered liability, dissolving entities designed to erase their own footprints. He was indicted before the month ended. Shaw and Company Banking was formally exonerated of deliberate fraud. The collapse had been engineered. Elena stood outside the commission building when she read the final line of the report. The November air was sharp, harbor wind cutting cleanly across Beacon Hill. She had imagined this moment for 10 years, imagined triumph, perhaps vindication that felt louder. Instead, what she felt was steadiness. Her father's name would no longer be spoken with lowered voices. The brass plate would not be restored, but the stain had been lifted. Across the street, Thomas waited. He had aged in these weeks, not visibly, but in posture. Investors had withdrawn quietly. Invitations had slowed. The Hargrove name would endure, but not untouched. "You were correct," he said when she approached. "So were you," she replied. He inclined his head slightly. "The audit revealed more than we expected." It had. Several transfers authorized during his wife's illness bore evidence of coercion. Documents placed before him amid medical consultations, explanations abbreviated, trust extended without scrutiny. He had not been villain. He had been negligent. And he knew it. "My wife wrote to your father," he said after a moment. "I have read every letter now." Elena held his gaze. She believed the truth would outlive discomfort. She was right. Silence settled between them, not fragile but considered. That afternoon, Elena returned to the Hargrove house one final time. She placed her father's restored banking certificate, newly issued by the commission, beside Mrs. Hargrove's last unfinished letter on the small desk in the East Wing. 2 names cleared by the same truth. As she turned to leave, she found the eldest daughter waiting in the doorway. The girl extended a folded slip of paper. "My mother would have liked you," it read in careful handwriting. She also believed things could be made right if someone was brave enough to say them out loud. Eleanor folded the note once and placed it inside her glove. In the front hall, Thomas stood beside the door. "The children's term is not yet concluded," he said, measured as ever. "You are, of course, free to pursue any opportunity you choose." "And if I chose to remain?" she asked. His expression did not shift, but something warmer moved beneath it. "Then you would remain," he said, "not as obligation, as choice." Choice. For 10 years, Eleanor's life had been governed by correction, restoring what was broken, clearing what was stained. Now the ledger before her was blank. She stepped out into the fading afternoon light. "Mr. Hargrove," she said quietly, "I will return on Monday." He did not smile. Neither did she. But something unspoken settled between them, not declaration, not promise. Possibility. As she walked down Commonwealth Avenue, Boston moved around her with its usual composure. Carriages passed. Newsboys called headlines. Society adjusted, as it always did. Behind her, a house that had once preserved grief now held something else. The beginning of trust, rebuilt not through romance declared, but through truth endured. And in the quiet of her boarding room that evening, Eleanor unfolded Mrs. Hargrove's final, unfinished letter one last time. "If anything should happen before we resolve this matter." The sentence still did not end. But now it no longer needed to.